I like that was the jacket that you wear, but she didn't have her. I like the color. I like the shit with your tan. I don't. Greater like for teacher show, we should talk about the very good. Really what to do. So, you know,
I love cooking.
where did you get it? So cute.
Oh, was so. Last year, yeah, and he's requested to call me like 4 times, and every time I. What are these things? You know, second course just. And I don't. Yeah. Oh, I was like even monster. How was I? Like they try to tap you. I think it says I'm Jewish in my head. I don't know. Like cute. That's cool. And I was like, yeah. So that's what. What?
Yeah. I started right.
Oh, I see you know.
War funding. Okay.
How's everybody doing?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah. It's like people didn't want to brave the monsoon. Don't worry, there's still people with umbrellas. You have to dodge. You don't hear me in the back? Is this thing on? Stuff. Okay. Does anybody have any announcements? Krista?
Here.
Uh-oh.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are y'all? Awesome. So like I announced last week, there's going to be a suicide prevention walk out of the darkness this upcoming Saturday where registration starts at 11 and we start walking around at noon. This is an issue that's very close to my heart because you are looking at somebody who has survived multiple suicide attempts. And I recently came back to school from psychological leave. So I am a very big proponent of suicide prevention. And I'm going to be speaking there this weekend talking about the importance of centering survivors of suicide attempts and pursuing anti-aggression work when it comes to this stuff. And it would be really meaningful if any of y'all could be there, and especially I'm making ribbons like to update it to emphasize the importance of that kind of thing. And I have flyers if anybody wants one, in case y'all are interested. Y'all can register ahead of time, but if you want to register the day of the walk too, that's also cool. But like Rihanna once famously said, tell your friends to pull up either way. If you know, if anyone wants a flyer, I can happily hand one out.
We can pass them around.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks, Krista.
Not a problem. Toss someone around.
See how long that takes to get around the room. Any other announcements? What's the date of that again, Krista? Okay. Don't forget to turn in the drafts of your papers. Yeah. We're in the process of assigning people to the graders. Hopefully that will be out by tonight or tomorrow, so that you know who it is that's actually grading your paper. and who you might want to meet with once you get feedback. And I can, if I am not your grader, congratulations. You're still welcome to come and talk to me about your paper. Okay. Don't have to go to one of the TAs. I just think that it's probably in the best interest to go to the person grade. That's
Are we allowed to use like samples of paragraphs that we've used for other papers? Because I've been researching how to talk with Joyce and work this. It's not that I'm copying and pasting it all their essay.
Yeah, if you've done research on the topic and you're continuing to research in this paper, it's okay to use pieces of other papers. You know, like if you want to like get technical about it, you should probably cite yourself.
Oh.
But
Yeah.
just you can just sort of say this is such and such, but it's really not that big of a deal. As long as you're not turning it into the same paper. For any other questions?
No.
It's entire pause.
I have two questions. One, do we have like a kind of format or does it need like so many years?
So the question is, can you have like an outline format or does it need to be more like clearly completed? I much clearly completed. If all you have in you right now is an outline, it's just the level of feedback you're going to get is going to be consistent with that level of action. So it may not be particularly helpful. So it's one of those you get out of it what you put into it. Does that make sense?
I'm pretty sure I put a different topic.
Totally fine to change your topic. We expect that, you know, like I asked if it's being this semester, I don't know why. All the time. But if you wanted to, I think that's clear. Theoretically, you could write a draft on one topic and write a final thing for another topic, but it's really bad. So, yeah.
I did say some second question, if you change the topic, do we have to read the Google form that you had?
You don't need to redo the Google Forms. I've already sent the Google Form out to PAs, and it's now like locked in to the old student Excel. So no. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Today is kind of the last day of like purely substantive kind of theoretical stuff that we're going to cover this semester. And starting on Thursday, we're going to go into particular policy domains. And as I said before, I really want those classes to be much more interactive. I might have a PowerPoint, I might not. But obviously I will help guide any discussion, but I do want it to be discussion and application of those materials to these topics. Okay. I believe that's all the announcements that I had. Anything in the news that people want to talk about?
Can you get back to, because I
Yes.
didn't find the source.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Yes.
It's like not super public policy related, but the level of pollen this year is just like unprecedented, which I just think is crazy.
Yeah, the level of pollen is.
If it gets worse from how it's been, I'm ready.
Luckily, I have a yellow house. Yeah. Impact is somewhat minimized.
Yeah, so in an international court, in an international human rights court in France ruled that Switzerland is at fault for failing to meet climate targets under human rights law, and it was by a group of women aged 64 and up that said like their health was at risk during heat waves related to global warming, and so they argued to the government that they were doing enough to mitigate climate change, and that's what they do their rights, and they won that case.
Interesting. I've not heard about that. Yeah, problem is, they won the case, but now what?
Yeah, in the article that one like political commentator was like from the US was like, I don't think this will do much to the US, and I was like, well,
It certainly won't do much to the US, and honestly, it probably won't do much to Switzerland. The big problem with international human rights law, calling it law, is that there's no enforcement. Like the courts in the United States have no internal enforcement mechanism. These courts don't really have any enforcement mechanism. I mean, the US has lost multiple cases in various human rights courts, especially in South America stuff. And they just ignore it. But the point is, you are making a normative statement that what you did was wrong. And you hope that it persuades.
so it should like please be better this time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's your hand up, sir. Yeah.
The Arizona Supreme Court upheld a law from 1864 banning all abortion except to save the life of the mother.
Really?
And the Arizona Attorney General said that she's not going to prosecute anyone accused of violating that law.
And prosecutorial discretion, reliably not. It's interesting because I would get challenged too, whether it's an appropriate use of prosecutorial discretion, whether or not you can do it blanket. Yeah, like this usually has to be on the case by case. Yeah.
Based on how things are looking for the North Carolina elections, we made that, whatever they decide on that, whether the AG is allowed to do that, we can have a big impact here too.
Oh, good. Yeah, absolutely.
So a few days ago in Ecuador, there has been the case of like, some police officers storming like the Mexican embassy to arrest like a former vice president, which violated a lot of the international laws. And then actually, the president of Mexico broke diplomatic relations with Ecuador. And then if you
Why is Ecuador in police?
they have no idea.
They don't.
No, well, because they wanted to get the ex-vice president, he has like corruption charges.
Right.
So he requested asylum from Mexico, but since he was
In
at the
Ecuador.
embassy, Quito, they decided to storm the embassy, which violates international law. Then some other countries,
It does.
they show solidarity with Mexico.
Yeah. Yeah, it violates all kinds of international law regarding asylum.
Give you a convention.
Again, it comes down to one of those. What do we do about it? Type of things. You can tell I'm not at all jaded about international human rights law.
Not then,
Not that.
you're legal.
I went to law school to study that.
That wouldn't help me. At all.
Yeah. No.
Vanderbilt expelled 3 students for protesting for justice in Palestine and like suspended 18 of them, like long term, for like 18 months or something. And
It was just for protesting?
well, they did a sit-in, like administrative.
It sit-in, so it was an administrative disruption.
But I mean, it's like still, it's like unprecedented.
Talk about that today. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. And like, there's also this thing all around the country where people are like targeting anti-Zionist Jewish and Palestinian groups, like at Columbia where they shut down JPP, and here at USC too. SJP just filed a like Title III complaint against UNC administration for like discriminating against Palestinian students. So lots of censorship going on.
Lots of censorship going on. Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit about the role of disruption, social movements and protests. That's interesting. Of course, Vandy's a private school, right? So they can get away with stuff. And public schools don't.
But they take a lot of public money.
They do. Yeah. Interesting stuff. Did anybody see that the Chief Justice Roberts and some other Supreme Court justices that they actually the Judicial Conference of the United States, which is headed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, issued a new policy sort of guidance on district court judges that have been putting in like nationwide injunctions. So in particular, there's this guy Kazmarek in Texas that everyone is going to. Like they're choosing him as their judge because he's very, very conservative and basically if they're anti anything, he's gonna uphold whatever they're doing. And so it's trying to prevent forum shopping in the courts, which has become a huge problem in the US. And so now there are like these judges that are like yelling at each other over this new policy. It's kind of fascinating.
What circuit is Texas in again?
Texas is in the fifth.
Oh, there you go, okay, that's the one.
That's the one.
Given the, I did read a thing, they're giving the Supreme Court a lot of problems lately.
They are giving the
It's
Supreme Court,
really annoying.
yeah, a lot of problems and yeah, they're tired of speaking up, I guess. So they made it somewhat official and then it's judges now, some of these judges are saying, well, we're just gonna refuse to comply. We're not recognizing the judicial conference as an appropriate governing body. Which is interesting, which then leads to the potential for impeachment of federal judges. Anyway, something to keep an eye on. Yeah, this intra-judge conflict. All right. Well, today what I want to talk about is interest groups and social movements, and what their role in politics and policy is, because they play a big role in American politics and policy, and it's something that you want to be incorporating into your papers and things like that. If you haven't at this point, obviously that's fine, but you know. I always forget to click on this thing one time. So worse. So when I'm talking about interests, really what I'm talking about are the sides and politics. The sides on any given political or policy issue. There are other definitions that are maybe a little bit more accurate or correct, but I kind of like the just sides and politics definition. Having a stake in a particular issue means you have an interest in it. Oftentimes we're talking about an economic stake, but it could also be a moral or psychological. Someone will either benefit or suffer because of a particular decision. They have an interest in that decision. But the important thing that I really want you to get is to understand that interests are distributed in society, right? We don't all share the same interests. I want you to think about who holds those specific interests, how big they are, right? Because if it's like a minor interest, then people aren't going to get too fired up. Who's on the other side? That's going to be a big part of whether or not you're able to actually protect your interests. And why it's so important is that it does set the environment in which we have achieved the current situation. Right? Whatever the status quo is based on essentially the winners of politics in the recent and not so recent past. And so what we're talking about today is whether or not people will actually motivate themselves, motivate others to mobilize to change the status quo. That's the big question, right? What role do interest groups and social movements have in changing the status quo? since lots of times, especially for social movements, that's really like their major goal. Yeah. So when it comes to political contests, you always want to think about the relative concentration of harm and benefit. Okay. Uh, the more spread out harms or the benefits are amongst the population, usually the smaller they are and the less we're really going to care about them. The more concentrated they are, more we're going to care about them. And the more likely we are to actually mobilize and protect those interests. So you get these sort of different types of contests that I try to give you some policy examples that sort of fit in each one. Like with diffused and diffused, you're talking about things like Social Security, right? And Social Security has long been thought of to be politically untouchable. But if somebody were to go after Social Security, there might be a problem in actually mobilizing people, either to change it or to protect it, sort of as it is. When you get concentrated and concentrated, this is where interest groups in particular play a big role. And where you see a lot of just clashing. So I have up here like unions and employers, hospitals and insurers. They tend to be repeat players, games. That's pretty intense battles. Something that the benefits are diffused and the costs are concentrated. Almost any kind of environmental regulation. Think about pollution regulation. Right, the benefits of regulating pollution are spread out amongst society as a whole, whereas the costs of them often are focused on the industry producing the pollution. That may be equitable in our minds, right? But what it does is it creates a situation where the people who are suffering the harms, like the concentrated thing, are much more likely to mobilize, much more likely to do something to protect their interests. Same thing is true up here, where the costs are diffused, the benefits are more concentrated. Any kind of social program based on poverty would be a good example. Federal spending, right? Earmarks is the classic example. But in each one, interest groups and social movements and other political actors are going to have different roles. So you want to be able to identify what type of contest that you're looking. Important to understand that sometimes we can fit any given contest into more than one of those boxes. So, like those little 2x2 matrices that we use all the time, they're helpful. But more often than not, they're more useful to think about them as continua and not binary. Yeah. What really matters is the relative concentration of costs to benefits. Are the people who are benefiting from this policy relatively more concentrated than those who are suffering from it? Whichever side is relatively more concentrated, they tend to win. And it's because it's easier for them to mobilize to protect the interests. You think about just this idea of national health insurance. The side that's relatively more concentrated is the insurance companies. Yeah. With energy, it's the producers of energy. Social welfare programs tends to be the recipients now. Yeah. And so each one of those, you just look at the relative balance and you can sort of predict who's going to win in any given situation. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be able to change the status quo. It more likely means that status quo was created by them in the first place. Maybe seems like a weird distinction. So what are interest groups? Obviously, they are groups of people who share an interest. Yeah. But we want to define them in such a way as to explicitly lay out their roles in trying to influence public policy. Because that's essentially why they exist. Some of them exist also as sort of a solidarity thing, being with like-minded people, that kind of stuff. But in general, they are created to impact policy. There's all kinds of interest groups out there. I'll show you some logos in a minute. I just like to point out some of these that people don't know or aren't as familiar with, like the National Federation of Independent Businesses. This is a huge interest group. It has a lot of power. Yeah, but most people really aren't aware of its existence. Most people also underestimate the impact of chambers of commerce. So what the interest group is it is some kind of physical manifestation of mobilization. It is a result of initial mobilization and then catalyst for sort of future mobilization. And I just want to make sure you know what mobilize is. Here are some interest groups that you may or may not be familiar with. I don't really need to say much about them. Just want to point out why some of them are here. The Family Medicine Interest Group. And I swear, if you just Google interest groups and look at the images, you'll find all these like doctors associations and all these things that are called interest groups. I mean, that probably are interest groups. There's all kinds of them. This is my favorite interest group of all time. The Hops, which was a group in Alabama. Alabama had some interesting laws when it came to alcohol. For example, they for a long time couldn't have brew pubs, couldn't brew your own beer or liquor, couldn't sell beer over a certain percentage of alcohol. There are all these like restrictions on alcohol in Alabama, and so Free the Hops formed to take them out and was very, very successful. Alabama actually has a lot of microbreweries now. Where I lived in Huntsville, Alabama, all kinds of crazy stuff. I just think it's one of the great names of all time. My uncle made all of his own beer, wine, liquor. Scared me.
I'm not with his brother too.
Yeah.
And they got better. Like I would say the first time they did it, it was very, very bad. But now they've gotten better. They're like they used their little sisters' grapes to make, and I was like, that's a family business. That's what it needs to be. But I think it's just because they're bored.
There's still a dry town in North Carolina,
Yeah.
isn't there?
Yeah. I'm still dry down.
Not like a year ago.
Oh, really?
There one, but they can only sell beer in one.
They only sell beer in one. I thought Boone was.
It was.
For a while, I swear it was.
They gave out one liquor license and the rest
Gave out
were
one
down,
liquor
didn't have.
Interesting.
Olive Channel and Dry County.
Oh, I know. That's why it was so interesting. I'm gonna have to use this.
It is in the mountains. Like
It's in the mountains. Yeah.
one glass.
Robbinsville. So
Yes.
listed nationally.
Robbinsville,
Yeah, that's where Grand County is.
Grand County.
You know Joyce Kilmer National, like, monument thing?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that.
Maybe we need to free the hops there. All right, so what is it that interest groups do? They do a lot of different things. They have a fairly broad role in politics and policy. On a very basic level, they are representatives of the interests involved. Okay, so they are trying, generally through official formal channels, to protect the interests of their group members. They encourage participation in the political process. Help with get out the vote campaign, and other things like that. They serve a huge role in education. As sources in the media, putting out their own press statements, putting out their own educational materials, also educating policymakers is a huge role of education. If you look at the interest groups that are generally the most successful, lots of times it really is based on the quality of the information that they're providing. Agenda building is a big part of it, both in terms of the government agenda and the public agenda. They actually provide analysis. They provide alternatives to existing problems that policymakers can latch onto and utilize. They also serve as important monitors of existing programs to make sure things are going as planned. There are lots of sort of public interest watchdog groups that look a lot at government spending to make sure we're not buying $500 toilets and that kind of thing. So interest groups, they tend to have sort of there's like a negative connotation, right, that we generally have with interest groups, especially if we associate them with lobbying. We have a very negative association with lobbyists, which is unfortunate because lobbyists generally are part of interest groups or other things, and they serve very important roles in terms of policy making. But so why is it that we allow these things to sort of exist, if you will? And basically, it's in the First Amendment, where we have the right to peaceably assemble. Peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievance. So we can organize, right? We can assemble. I feel like I just. There's some superhero group that says something assembly. This is Avengers Assembly? Yeah. That's what I thought. They want to throw it south to the but that's what's going on. And really anyone can do this. It's important to understand that the First Amendment is not supposed to moderate content. That's one of the big rules. Although apparently at Vanderbilt and some other places, maybe that's not going on. So I really want to think about this in very, very basic terms of why we allow interest groups, because a lot of us are concerned about the potential for too much power within interest groups, within American politics. And so thinking about things very, very basically, people act out of self-interest. People who share an interest will join forces to protect them. Maybe. Right? Sometimes there's going to run counter to the interests of some common good. And we cannot, or at least we should not, stop such activity in a free society. This is what essentially led to Federalist Paper number 10. He's talking about factions. Right? And why we should allow these things to go. But we do have to figure out ways to control them. And we're going to talk in a little bit about, again, a little bit about iron triangle, things like that. But we have to figure out ways to minimize the interests of particular groups so that it's not at the expense of all other groups. All right. So in terms of how we do that, there's two basic perspectives that people take. Madison basically said, look, there's going to be sides, right? By definition, there are two sides, at least, to any given policy problem. And people who have interests on each side will join up and they'll organize and they'll mobilize to protect those interests and essentially kind of cancel each other out. That's the idea of pluralism. Critics of pluralism, generally people who subscribe to elitism, argue that inevitably the wealthy and groups that represent interests of the wealthy are going to dominate the game. Okay. And therefore all sort of policy is going to be skewed towards their interests as opposed to everybody else. And which one of these two schools of thought you happen to subscribe to, it really dictates how much we have to worry about interest groups. Okay. If you're good with the pluralist idea, right, it's sort of a free market idea, you don't really have to worry about interest groups that much. If you think that this is more likely to be true, then you probably do, right? And a lot of the differences in how people think about interest groups is related, probably subconsciously, to this dichotomy. So, any questions so far? So we looked at the iron triangle before, right? Didn't I draw it on the board or something? I don't know. The iron triangle is one of those things that's like bedrock poli-sci. And it's like markets in econ. Every class has to talk about it. Yeah. But the basic idea is that you have this triangle of interest, the triangle of actors, where you've got the relevant administrative agency on one corner, you've got Congress, or more specifically, a committee of Congress at another corner, and then you've got interest groups at the last corner. And the idea is that the vast majority of public policy gets made in the interactions between these three groups. And it is very difficult for groups to come in from the outside, right, and have an impact. So this is one of the reasons why interest groups are so important when we're talking about politics and policy, is that they're one of the key players, especially when it comes to any kind of bureaucratic rulemaking. All right. That's sort of the basics of interest groups, but want to think about how and why people actually mobilize. And generally speaking, you go back to that 2x2 matrix I had before. As I've said, when the costs are concentrated and the benefits are concentrated, you're generally going to get the interest rates. It is the concentration of the cost of the benefits that really matter in terms of mobilization. And I don't care what the rest of this is. I just want you to know where scripts lie. But I felt like I had to show it. So one of the big problems that interest groups have is essentially the free rider problem. Everybody remembers that?
Mhm.
Yeah. You know, you've got these people trying to enjoy the benefits that the interest groups provide, like the policy changes or the existing policies and that kind of thing. But they don't want to pay their dues, right? How many of y'all get like mail from like the Sierra Club with like a sticker? Or do y'all get mail? I don't even know anymore.
Usually it's
Just coupons.
and bank statements, not like.
Coupons and things.
And spam mail from like the, what you call it, car dealers.
Or oatmeal from, that is a lot unfixed.
Yeah. Anyway,
Check card.
the Sierra Club used to, I don't know that they still do. They just send out these mass mailings and they'd always include a sticker in there. That was a way to try to guilt you into actually contributing to them. Because if you use the sticker, then they feel like you're going to feel guilty unless you actually gave them money. Right? Of course, a lot of people don't seem to suffer from guilt. And so they just use stickers. There's generally 3 types of benefit. I'm holding up 4 fingers. That interest groups will seek to provide people to entice them to join. And they want them to join for lots of reasons. One is just money, right? One is numbers. If they can say we have 1 million members, well, then policymakers are much more likely to listen to that, especially if they can say we have 1 million voters, which is why the AARP is such a strong interest group, right? Because it's a bunch of old people, which apparently includes me now. I got an advertisement on my computer this morning wanting me to join AARP. And I was like, I'm not old. I'm just not. Anyway, it was very upsetting. But I'm dealing with it. The AARP, though, because they have so many members, and because their members tend to vote, they have a lot of say in politics policy. So the first type are like material things. So this could be the sticker that the Sierra Club sent out, but it could also be like policy related things, like we're going to give you, lower taxes and give you increased wages, whatever. But the free rider problem in general, right? There's so many organizations that face it. And a lot of them, what they do is they do like fund drives and they give out free stuff, like NPR. Or you can get a sweatshirt or a mug or dinner for Paris. The National Rifle Association actually offers health insurance to its members, which could be a pretty cool benefit. I mean, it's free, you still have to pay for it, right? But it gets you into a pool of people that makes it cheaper than if you're buying it by yourself. But these are material benefits that they will hand out. There's also purposive benefits, and this is really when they're fulfilling the purpose of the interest group. They're actually protecting the interests involved. And then there's solidarity, which is again providing a place for like-minded people to hang out, to feel like they're part of something bigger. And so when you're thinking about interest groups and you're thinking about how they get their members and their money, I want you to think about these 3 things. Is some of them, have to do more material stuff because they're not that effective in terms of the purpose of things. AARP though does all of them because they give you like discounts everywhere. It's a theme in my family. My wife got the senior discount at Harris Teetersville. Not good.
You cannot be serious.
Yeah, she said, I don't even, she's like, I'm not even gonna ID you.
Oh.
And you have to be 60. My wife looks young and she's not even close to 60. Anyway, okay. I gotta get over this. But
Got a discount?
she got 5% off.
Something.
Yes.
Right.
Market are expensive, you gotta take what you can.
Yeah, and like I'm not gonna argue with them about it either. Want to give me 5% off, fine. But I'm just telling you, I'm not 60. All right. So what do most interest groups look like? Because I feel like we have this idea of these like crusaders, who are out there working in the common good and that kind of thing. But 75% represent some kind of occupational interest, like the family medicine interest group. 75%. The other 25% are more what we would normally consider to be public interest or civic organizations that share some kind of substantive interest. But the vast majority of them are related to work, business. And it makes sense that this is the case, right? If mobilization requires organization, and you're already organized as a business, then it's much easier to just continue that organizational process. If you're having to start from scratch, people you don't know, you won't have any other connections with, it's much, much harder. Yeah. So a lot of the first interest groups in the US came out of professions in particular, like the National Bar Association, the American Medical Association, so those types of things. It's important just to know that unions developed relatively late in the United States. And relatively, I'm comparing it here to Europe. But oftentimes people will ask or think about interest groups, what the role of unions sort of are. And unions are relatively weak in the US. They're actually getting stronger right now, which is interesting. I don't know exactly why, but the reason why historically they were weak was because they developed late. And if you just think about how important history is in terms of establishing the status quo and then maintaining the status quo, well, then newcomers are likely going to be on the outside looking in. Why do we care about this? Anybody want to answer this question? You flinched, so I called on you.
Yeah. Because big point of union is kind of to like protect the people, like the workers itself, right? And a lot of these business organizations kind of look more top down focused, like forget about like OSHA or what's with
Right.
the human, workers protections and whatnot. And so having that imbalance can sometimes like forget about like the actual like human impact, like the human protections put in place for work.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think it's important when we're thinking about that pluralism versus elitism distinction, that, in a purely pluralistic sort of society, unions probably, even if they develop late, should have at least approached the political impact of employers, which they have. Even if the is it the Dartmouth The men's basketball team just unionized.
The university has so far just completely refused to recognize that. They're like, no, they didn't. They didn't do that. That's not actually a union.
I love that.
Because they're not employees, so they can't form a union.
But they are employees because they have a,
Yeah, and I know.
they have a code of conduct.
Technically, the university can't pay them with NIL. That has to, the NCAA rules currently say it has to come from outside. So
Yeah, but the National Labor Board says that employees aren't always paid. They're paid with benefits, they're paid with scholarship.
Yep.
They have a code of conduct,
So this
They
will go
have-
to the courts.
designated working times. They have specific, like, working residence halls.
Yeah.
I think they're employees.
I don't disagree with that notion. All right. So what types of resources do interest groups need to have to be successful? Obviously, the first thing we think about is money. But really, the most important one is the members. And there's a couple of aspects to membership that are important. The sheer number is important. The intensity is really important. How much do they care about it? Are you able to get them out at rallies, or other things like that? The prestige of the members can be important. Because they might have more of a public stage on which to pass on the message. So all of these things are really, really important to the success of the interest groups. Money is important. If we have time and we talk about the lobbying game, you'll find out that money is important, but it's not as important as connections. Now, to a certain extent, money can buy connections, but really we're talking about pre-existing connections. That's what really matters. And either fortunately or unfortunately for y'all, that's what matters when you're getting jobs. Just to throw that out there. So I just talked about this. Like, do they have access? Do they have connections to the people in power? People who are actually responsible for making the policy? Or do they have access to the media, which can greatly increase their ability to set the public agenda, and do things like that? Okay, so just some broad questions that I want you to be thinking about. It's just a fact that a lot of interest groups stay away from elections. Anybody have a theory as to why? Meaning that they don't donate money, they don't endorse candidates, they just literally stay away from elections. Kristen?
Because for them to pay candidates to run and whatnot, they would be violating, like, they can lose their tax exempt status and nonpartisan status.
Yeah, but if it's a for-profit company, right, then they're not tax exempt. But there are some interest groups that are 501c3s. But there's also 501c4s, 5s and 7s, things like that. But it is definitely a concern with, if you think about, the Presbyterian Church, like as an interest group, then yeah.
Because my mama always said, you gotta work with who gets in there.
You got to work with who gets in there. Your mama is a very, very
You
wise.
don't know who it's gonna be,
Right.
but it's gonna be Cherry Wells.
We all know. All good try to get access to all
Yeah.
those carriers.
Get an apartment in Candler, Weaverville, claim residency there for a little while. Hang out with me.
Yeah, like if you are a little bit vague, you can have more people like or more support potentially.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, that's pretty much what I was gonna say. I worked for a special interest group before at the National Hospice Provided Care Organization. And we would basically shout out politicians only if they did something specific
Right.
in the hospice interest, like then they were cool, but other than that, we just,
Just didn't do it.
yeah, we just lobbied everybody.
Yeah, but it is basically, you gotta work with whoever's in there. Which is why, interest groups who do donate money, who do you think they donate to? Like on what basis do they donate? Is it Republican, Democrat? Yeah,
To both.
to both. It really is whoever the incumbent is. Right? Because as we learned, incumbents are much more likely to win. So you go and you look at like who Apple donates to. But you can do it on Open Secrets. You can, find out who all these people donate to, businesses, and it is very much a mixed bag. All right. How do you think technological change has affected the ability of people to mobilize? Yeah.
It's made it easier, like, you don't have to have someone standing in the street, you can like rally here in a fortnight or something, I don't know what they used to
In
do.
a fortnight.
Like, I don't even know how they used to mobilize
I
people.
didn't know we used the word fortnight outside of the game.
Or like, I don't know what they would say, it's like, it's hard to imagine how they used to mobilize before technology. Like, you had to read the paper and then remember that in a week and show up,
Right.
so.
There's a lot of interesting stuff in there. But yeah, I mean, it does make it a lot easier to mobilize, right? You can give people more information, tell people in real time, like where to go, what to do, what to say, all of those types of things. We saw really probably the first big impact of increased social communications technology with the Arab Spring. But you're seeing, more and more of it. I'm a little concerned that maybe we can't remember things a week later. So that's okay. I can't. If I don't look at my calendar every morning, I'm screwed. Does mobilization inevitably lead to access? No. Right? You can get all kinds of mobilization and never really get the kind of access that you get. There is a sort of inequity in influence. It is just a fact, I believe, that wealthier people have more power. Money may not buy happiness. So I'm still not convinced, which is why I play the lottery. But it can buy access. We've also seen over time declining membership in things like civic groups, which means that fewer of us are exposed to a lot of the issues that we might actually care about. Leaving the people who are much more intensely focused on those issues to be the ones that are kind of dictating what's going on. And then we've just got a general declining interest in politics, which I think I was reading about this just last night, and I think y'all's generation is going to turn that around. I don't know why I think that exactly, but I feel like there's an uptick in general interest in politics over the last couple of years, at least when I've been teaching, is that people have been a little bit more aware of what's going on. So hopefully this is something that your generation will fix. I saw some very dubious looks when I said.
I think you're right.
Okay, there we go. All right, want to change focus a little bit, talk about social movements. Before I do that though, I neglected to give y'all a chance to share a random fact. Didn't he?
J. Cole apologized to Kendrick Lamar, for dissing.
So,
On the topic of Fortnite from earlier, you can now do all of the bending from Avatar: The Last Airbender in Fortnite.
really?
That was added yesterday.
I'll have to tell my son about that. Although, you know, he probably knows. Because, although he doesn't have any social media. Like, my son's almost 18, and he literally has no social media. Yeah. Of course, he does nothing but read. Anyway.
JoJo Siwa released, and it's like super homoerotic. But it's also really bad, so like we stand part of me is like, and then they're like.
So it was good effort and poor execution.
And I think it's like bad all around, but like, JoJo's the theme of overcoming homophobia and the hater.
Okay, let's choose to focus on that aspect.
Yeah.
So just also making wild claims like she invented gay pop as a genre and like nobody else in our generation has undergone such dramatic change. And I think those are a little bit outrageous. Yeah.
Okay, cancel me. Sorry.
Point out the irony of the fact that we're in a class where we're talking about like interest groups and social movements, and it's suddenly become a conversation about JoJo Siwa. But at the same time, she's somebody that does have influence. Whether it's good or bad, I'm not gonna.
Another fact about the JoJo Siwa song, it's actually a scrapped 2013 song meant for Miley Cyrus. That Miley Cyrus team was just like, you want this? So it's very funny that she says she's inventing gay pop when she is actively singing a scrapped Miley Cyrus song.
It would have been way better finally.
So did Miley Cyrus invent gay pop?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm willing to believe that. I don't know. I'm a big Miley Cyrus. I actually, this is one thing I'll say real quick. I'm one of those people that when I'm working, I have to have something on in the background. You know, other people are like that, right? Yeah, one of the things that I put on in the background is Hannah Montana. Yeah, because I find it.
Charlotte the stingray, there's scientists that are worried that her babies might not be alive anymore because
Oh no.
she's been pregnant for too long, and so there's questions on like if she aborted them herself.
That's so sad. I saw Charlotte.
Yeah, I'll try.
Huh. Okay. That's depressing.
Oh,
Being happy.
you think
about
they're yeah.
All right, I've just got like 10 minutes, so. Social movements. A couple definitions, just because I didn't feel like one fully captured everything. Series of contentious performances, displays, and campaigns by which ordinary people make collective claims on others. Okay. Authority. Collective challenges by people with common purposes and solidarity and sustained interaction with elites, opponents, and authorities. Okay. Sets of opinions, beliefs, in the population which represent preferences for changing some elements of the social structure and or distribution of the society. These are all academic definitions. When you think of a social movement, how do you define it?
a radical one that actually
Radical one.
goes after the structures of power.
I think that's probably a pretty accurate representation of what most people think of when they think about social movement is some radical attempt to drastically alter the social structure.
Radicalism's a bad thing, though, necessarily.
No, I don't think it is either. But yeah, you know, generally speaking, there's a couple things that they have in common, right? You've got this collection of people, but they share an identity or purpose, sort of like an interest group. They share this set of beliefs or policy preferences. They want to change the status quo. All again sounds sort of like interest groups. They engage in some sustained public effort making collective claims against property and or society. This is where the real difference comes in. Is social movements, generally speaking, are coming from the outside. And they are challenging authority. They're not trying to use authority to make change. They're actually challenging authority or other social structures. So I think that's important. Sheila, I saw you had your hand up.
Oh, I think like I feel like there's a lot of social movements that aren't like I feel like there's like a lot of like conservative social movements, not like Tea Party conservative, but like I think like reactionary feminist.
Well, yeah, there's lots of different types of social movements. In fact,
And I
that's
feel like-
exactly what we're going to talk about.
I feel like it's just like about political common sense. But yeah, that was
About
just really
political
common sense, like
common sense,
social movements create or attempt to create a political realignment.
a political realignment. Yeah, I think that's probably true. Yeah, there's lots of different types of social movements, and I'll go through these quick. Like there are reform movements, right, that are generally trying to reform some aspect of our political, economic, or social system. There are revolutionary movements, which is maybe more like the radical ones, but revolutionary literally in the sense of wanting to get rid of the existing government. And hopefully replace it with something better. There are reactionary movements, which arise in situations where people want to block change or reverse change that has already occurred. So, you know, on the first slide, I had the Tea Party logo. Like the Tea Party would be, in most situations, a reactionary movement. There are self-help movements. I'm not using self-help in the same sense as like self-help books, but you get the idea. There are religious movements. There's a bunch of them, and this is just like it's smattering. I don't think I've ever said the word smattering in class. So I want to talk about sort of some of the key differences between interest groups and the social movements. Interest groups tend to have relatively narrow interests. They tend not to operate under broad umbrellas. Like we wouldn't call a political party an interest group. They are generally trying to enact change from within the system, whether that be through lobbying members of Congress or going to Judge Kaczmarek or some other judge trying to get a decision in their favor. They are trying to act within the system. They tend to be more organized, directed. Well, and they can be the result of a social movement. They can actually participate in social movements. You know, one of the big challenges with social movements is once it gets going, how do you keep it going? Does anybody remember a social movement from a while ago called Occupy Wall Street?
Sort of.
Sort of, right? We don't really hear much about Occupy Wall Street these days, do we? Or the 99 percenters. But back in the day, right, it was a really big deal. That's a social movement that failed to sustain itself. Um, social movements in general have broader interests. But lots of times is looking out for the welfare of a particular people. They are trying to enact change from outside the system. That's really the big difference. They're not trying to use official channels and that kind of thing. They're less hierarchical, less organized. I think for all of these things, the Black Lives Matter movement is a great example where it's not at all hierarchical, right? It's completely decentralized. There are like chapter group, there is a official sort of networking group, but in general, it is more of a amorphous thing. Yeah.
It's funny you say that, because I remember when the BLM founders were under fire for the way they used their finances. I think one of them could choose font colors that like use it to buy a mansion. You have to look this up again, but I just find it funny that you say it's non-hierarchical when it's like the payments, like.
But it is, if you look at the way it's structured, there's three people who were the first ones to do the sort of hashtag Black Lives Matter type thing. But they never created a centralized organization for that. And lots of interest groups are often much more top down than bottom up. Social movements tend to be bottom up. But I mean, we've had a ton of social movements, right, throughout our history. I don't go through all of them. Some of them successful, some of them not. But one of the things that really defines social movements as being distinct from interest groups is that they engage in some kind of disruption. Whether that be protests, rallies, sit-ins, die-ins, all the different things that people employ to disrupt everyday activity as a way of spreading their message. The die-in is where you go and you lay down and you pretend to be dead because whatever's happening. They used to do it a lot with cigarettes. And one of the, I think one of the more interesting sort of questions about social movements is like, what kind of disruption is okay? What kind is not? At what point, does the disruption overshadow the message? That's where I sometimes have issues with stuff. And, that's one of the things where, and look, a lot of it has to do with framing, of how you frame things, right? Is it a protest or is it a riot? You saw that a lot with the Black Lives Matter protests. You got one side saying it's a protest, and one side saying it's a riot. What that's getting at is one is an acceptable level of disruption, and the other one is unacceptable. But that to me is really the defining characteristic of engaging in some kind of disruptive activity. How do they affect policy? There's lots of ways. It's mostly indirect. Could be agenda setting. Could be public awareness. That's a big part of it. It's obviously related to agenda setting. Issue framing, like I was just talking about, framing can be a big thing. So if you can get a particular policy issue reframed in a in the public consciousness, you can often succeed at achieving your goals. So when I think about framing, one of the ones that always comes to mind is the inheritance tax, which has been very successfully reframed as a death tax. Because like, you're gonna tax me because I die, right? It becomes almost absurd. But just a solid frame. They can sometimes provide social events. They can affect cultural values and beliefs, which then flow into public opinion, which then potentially flows into public policy. They influence the participants' ideas and beliefs. That's a big part of it, almost like an educational aspect. And sometimes they actually result in policy change. I think a good example of that is actually MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which really was sort of a social movement in the 80s in particular. And then developed into a well-organized kind of interest group type deal. But MAD is very much responsible for setting the drinking age at 21. So from a policy output point of view, they were all right, well, y'all is backing up. I guess I'm done. Time is running out. Thursday. I will see you all on Thursday. Remember, I'm prepared.
Oh, right. Obviously not. Did not know.
I really.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if that's. I want to go. Thank you so much.
Spare me a feather.
Yeah, your extra feathers.
It's fine, we can, you know.
You could write down the by having seen higher subject.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
I don't even know what I would do.
Yeah.
like, did you fill out the Google Docs though? That's one. We look up our results.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the showing my draft.
Yeah.
If this is acceptable. That's what I'm thinking about. But I'm gonna write about like.
I